One of the biggest lifting debates of all time is how hard you should be training. On one end of the spectrum, you have the Mike Mentzer hit heads, where it's to failure and beyond, but with only a little bit of volume. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have the science-based guys, where volume's more important, and as long as you're within a couple reps of failure, then you'll be okay. But what if you did both? What if you not only took every set to failure, but also did it with high volume? Well, that's exactly what I did. For over a year, I went to failure and beyond on every set and worked up to high loads of volume. In this video, I'll discuss how it affected my recovery, my volume and frequency, my progression, and my overall gains, along with talking about was it even worth it and how you can apply failure training to your own lifting practices. But first, like and subscribe. This is a new channel, but I've been making videos for a while, and if you guys enjoy this content and find it useful, why not stick around? But let's get into it. But first, let's define what failure training actually is. I define it as you cannot possibly get another rep without serious form breakdown. Now this varies from exercise to exercise. For example, on a bicep curl, I would give it a couple ugly cheat reps before I called it failure, whereas for a squat, I'm going to call it failure before it starts looking like a good morning. Training to failure on every exercise really began for me at the beginning of 2023 when I was experimenting with an upper-lower split. Because I couldn't do as much daily volume during this workout split, I had to up the intensity to make up for it. After a few months of experimenting with training to failure on everything, I decided to go all in and make this a conscious experiment for the next year. Some of the initial benefits during those first few months that I noticed were first, increased work capacity, especially when paired with the way I work out, which was supersets, meaning that you're doing an exercise back to back. And I do that on every single exercise. Going to failure and then jumping to another exercise and going to failure immediately afterwards builds that dog in you. It really takes a lot to go from one to another and keep your intensity at such a high level. I also noticed I developed a much more finely tuned connection to my muscles, not only in knowing how many more reps I had left in a set before I even reached that point, but also knowing when a muscle was done training. Knowing that, okay, that set was the last. I'm not even going to do the other volume that I have programmed because I am beat and I feel that point. Your base level of intensity also increases. Going to 0 reps in reserve doesn't really feel hard anymore on a lot of exercises, and that burn that you get really only happens when you swap in a new exercise. Your intensity levels just become normal, and so high intensity becomes higher intensity, if that makes sense. As for the final initial benefit, I had no doubt in my mind that these workouts were building muscle, as long as I had my recovery locked down. And speaking of recovery, training to failure on every single set is brutal on your recovery. Overall, I had a ton of systemic fatigue, and initially I had to take a lot more time in between my sets resting before I could go at it again. I would wake up the next day absolutely exhausted from my workout the day before, and it only got harder as the intensity stayed at 101% the whole time. But where there's weakness, there's an opportunity for improvement. Another avenue of progression opened up for me, which was making my workouts faster, moving between sets at a quicker pace and overcoming that fatigue from going to failure as my body adapted. And that's what your body does. Through the repeated bout effect, you kind of get used to it, and this resilient ass machine that is made out of flesh, water, and other weird stuff that makes my brain electrocute itself and want big muscles? Yeah, that thing's pretty cool. You are tougher than you think, but your recovery has to be on point. There is absolutely no point in trying this if you are not bulking, eating, and sleeping consistently good. I'm not just talking like, yeah, I hit most of my meals and I got a good bedtime. I mean, you are locked in serious, because that's what I did, and it was still really, really fucking tough. As for the health of my joints with all this heavy duty training, I was completely fine because I was going heavy in the 6 to 20 rep range, not the sub 5. You have to be conscious of your longevity when it comes to applying these training principles, and your intensity doesn't change simply because you're in a different rep range. It's just your mentality of still going hard at it despite you're doing 20, 30 reps on some exercises. And despite all the grindy reps and painful sets, I experienced 0 injuries because the quality of movement doesn't change with the intensity even when doing sheet reps and intensity techniques. Having good form only amplifies how hard a movement is because you're much stricter with the muscles that you're using. When it comes to volume and frequency, the Mike Mentzer fanatics were actually right. At first, because I had to reduce my volume. With the increased intensity, I just simply couldn't do the same amount that I was doing on my push-pull leg split on this new upper-lower split. But that didn't mean that things stayed that way. At first, I started out with the regular old 2 times a week frequency for everything, but then I discovered that I recovered from high intensity quicker than I did from high volume. So from there, I realized that your volume is auto-regulated from your intensity, so why not increase your frequency? So I did by adding an arm day in the middle of my week, and it was an absolute game changer. Adding this arm day essentially maxed out my upper body frequency and intensity, so it left me a completely new arena to focus in, which was pushing more volume. And this was my goal for the entire bulk that I did with this past failure training. Although I started with lower volume first to adapt to the new training split and the new level of intensity, I did not let it remain there. I built it back up. I think that's the biggest mistake that high intensity advocates make, is they don't realize that they have a huge lever of progression waiting to be handled. And I loved pushing my sets from their initial starting point back to where it was previously before I was doing all this failure and past failure training. It also teaches you which exercises are majorly fatiguing and which ones are not. And this is really helpful when you're making superset pairs to get through your workout more efficiently and get more gains within the session. After a while, I got used to the failure training combined with the increased volume, so I started implementing intensity techniques to push them to the next level, implementing these cheat reps, drop sets, lengthened partials, rest pause to just unlock this new level of intensity. I don't even know what to refer to it as. Super Saiyan 2 intensity. But anyways, if you want to learn more about how to implement those intensity techniques into your training, check out my arm video. I created a progression scheme called Intel Death Dynamic Double Progression that will help blow up your arms using intensity techniques like drop sets. One of the biggest criticisms of training to failure on everything is that it is super hard to make progress. Because where do you go from 100%? Yeah, you might improve every couple weeks, but it's not gonna be a consistent linear improvement over a long time. But there's just one flaw when it comes to this line of thinking. Getting stronger, whether it be through reps or weight, is not the only form of progression. You have to be creative, and you gotta have more tools in your arsenal than just more weight on the bar or an extra rep. I did this in a multitude of ways, and I had plenty of plans of attack. First and foremost is adding quality volume throughout the week and within the workout. I did this by slowly increasing my sets over time. This is not over time in weeks, this is over time in months and throughout the year before I eventually reach high volume at high intensity. While you're doing that, you can also focus on maintaining performance while increasing that volume. Let's say you have an exercise, but now you're doing it after there's a train going by. And while you're doing that, you can also focus on maintaining performance while adding that extra volume. Let's say you have an exercise on chest that you were initially doing after 3 sets of bench press beforehand, but now you add an extra 2 or 3 sets before you do this exercise. Your goal is to now get back to that performance you had when you were less fatigued. Another form of progression is increased control and range of motion on your movement. Movement quality is an underrated aspect of progression. And then the 2 forms of progression that I mentioned earlier, getting through your workouts faster while maintaining that level of effort, and then intensity techniques where you get another chance to add more reps, whether it's through partial reps, drop sets, or cheat reps. There's another chance to add more progression and beat last week. So in the end, who was right, the high intensity bros or the science-based boyos? Well, as you can tell, neither. they can both do better in their training. So based off everything that I've learned in the past year, here is how I think failure training should be applied and balanced with everything else in your workout. First of all, I think everybody can use an intensity boost. This does not mean go balls to the wall immediately. If you are making a good progression rate of gains, there is no reason to switch things up drastically. But incrementally increasing the amount of work that you're doing, whether it's in set or over your entire workout, and the effort levels that you put in is always a good thing. You need to test your limits from time to time so you know the amount of effort that you're capable of putting in. And also you've got this in your back pocket in case progress slows down and you need to crank it up a few notches. Everybody is different and needs to find a sustainable balance between frequency, volume, and intensity. I'm a gym nerd and this is what I'm obsessed about, so I can crank all three dials at once and see what happens, but for everybody else, they need to find what works best for them. Because at the end of the day, the training that you have the most fun with is the training that you're gonna work the hardest at. Alright, let's get into which movements should be hit with failure training every single time and which ones maybe aren't the best for it. Starting off with your smaller muscle groups, your biceps, triceps, shoulders, and calves should be smashed to oblivion with failure and pass failure training. These muscle groups are tanks. They have no problem recovering quickly, and I've found that higher intensity works better than higher volume when it comes to this. This also goes for large muscle group isolations like your leg extension, your hamstring curl, or your lat pull down. Since they're usually programmed later in the workout as a finisher exercise, there's really no point in leaving anything in the tank, so go balls to the wall on these and make some serious gains. As you can see, the movements and muscle groups that lend themselves to lengthened partials, which is essentially doing extra partial reps in the lengthened position, are some of the best movements to implement failure training on. Pretty much all back movements, tricep movements, things like chest flies and leg extensions are a go for failure training. Large compound movements like your bench, squat, deadlift, barbell row, and weighted calisthenics shouldn't always be taken to failure. They are really fatigue inducing and limits the amount of volume that you can do within your workout. You have to find a fine balance. For me, a lot of the times it's going to failure on that last set, but for the first two, leaving a little bit in the tank. If they are your primary heavy movement, usually the movement that you start off for in that muscle group, then you should run something like a linear progression of some sort to really build that strength and avoid having too much fatigue that you can't do the requisite volume that you need for the rest of your workout. I have only now been able to push the volume envelope a little bit higher for my chest and my legs when I've taken the intensity just a bit off my squats and bench to add chest flies and more quad and hamstring volume at the end of my workout. So what I learned over the past year was that it is entirely possible to do high intensity failure training and high volume at the same time. It just takes a while to build up to it, and you have to be extremely consistent when it comes to your recovery. I think everybody can benefit from an intensity bump within their training and getting a little crazy with it sometimes. But at the end of the day, as I mentioned earlier, it's what you enjoy and most consistently stick with, but from time to time, show your body what's up and really push its limits. Anyways, thanks guys for watching. If you enjoy this video, like and subscribe, please. It helped me out a ton, and I'm out. Peace.